The environment is filled with toxins. There are plastics, which will reduce sperm counts. Sperm counts are half what they were 50 years ago. There are trace amounts of pharmaceutical drugs in the drinking water. There is growth hormone in beef. There's nanoparticulates of aluminum in the air and in the soil. There's a lot of stuff in our environment that we are not evolutionarily conditioned to absorb into our bodies. We don't know what the long-term effects of a lot of this stuff will be. And the drop in sperm counts and fertility rates in the West is concerning. So it seems like the environment is conspiring to kill us, and then the cultural environment, likewise, is filled with toxic elements that discourage high fertility behavior. How can you avoid this? You can avoid the cultural elements yourself by only watching things that are edifying, but even then, most people don't maintain that because the high production value, like hypnotizing programming that's available, is too tempting, and maybe you just want to, eat dinner with your wife and child and put something on TV and maybe relax after a long day of work, right? That's tempting. I do that sometimes, and I know that the stuff always contains messages that are subversive at some level or another, but you can't really cut it out altogether. And if you have kids, they're going to watch some form of media that you don't necessarily approve of. When they're with their grandparents, when they're at a daycare, if they go to public school, you can't shelter them completely, not if you live in society. So there are physical and mental, cultural elements that are conspiring to kill us, to reduce our fertility, to eliminate our lines of descent. What can we do to stop that? I think this is a much more fundamental question than the racial demographics of the future or the political structure of the future. How are you going to survive? These environmental factors, even if we changed the political institutions, the media landscape would still exist. The people would still be alive who are pumping out the culture that we're absorbing now, and obviously the environment wouldn't just recover overnight. You need stringent regulations to fix some of the situation, and it might just be irreparable in a certain respect. There may be no going back. But, you don't even have to be concerned for the sake of the environment, but long term, this is scary stuff. So how do you survive? You could go off into the woods on your own and grow your own food and have a water purifier and, buy supplements from Alex Jones and that sort of thing, and maybe you'll be better off than others. But part of fertility is also psychological and social, where you don't feel comfortable having kids if you don't have a tribe. If you're an outcast, your body tells you, your brain tells you you're an outcast, you're not safe, you shouldn't be taking extra risks and responsibility at this point in time. If you do have a good connection with your parents, with the parents of your partner, with some uncles and aunts and cousins and siblings, and you have a real community that has lasted a long time, then you feel comfortable having kids. And it's usually those kind of family-oriented people that do have kids. So going into the woods has its own low fertility consequences. And what about going into the woods together, right? Take your community and go out and start something new. That's promising, but there are mechanisms that allowed us to behave in that way in the past. Humans by nature are not all that agreeable. We are selfish, we pursue our own ends, we seek power. One of the primal myths derives from the sequence of the alpha male being taken over or overthrown by some beta, and they become the new alpha. And this is like the hero slays the tyrant, becomes the tyrant, a hero comes and slays him. That's a very fundamental thing built into our hierarchies. And so that's going to play itself out. But the way that that stays together culturally, tribal groups stay together, is that there's something larger than just the personalities involved. It's not just who they are and their rationality. It's not just the kind of verbal, declarative modes that we engage with every day today, almost exclusively, or at least consciously, that's what we're engaged with. In the past, communities stayed together because they were embodiments, they saw themselves as being embodiments of archetypes which lived on. They were totems of the tribe which lived on, and these were irrational images. They've always been irrational images. Some people might like to think that we can replace that with some kind of rationalist system, like the original positivist, as far as I'm aware, Auguste Comte, who basically said that we can only say things that we can prove through empiricism and rationality. And he developed a system for how this would work, and then he went on to spell out what society would have to look like. And he studied sociology, and he realized like people need rituals, they need all of these temples, things of this nature, and so he devised this whole civic religion to act as a surrogate. And at that point, people began to realize that this whole project was ridiculous, and they abandoned it. Auguste Comte was popular early on, and then he lost popularity when people kind of recognized the larger implications. Nassim Taleb would look at this problem and say that we don't know with our theories the totality of what's going into the evolutionary process that's sustaining our lives. Now, I know Nassim Taleb has fallen out of favor recently because of some comments on IQ, whatever. His core point still stands, that rationality, ex post facto justification, and theorizing is never up to speed with the actual living evolutionary process itself. Evolutionary systems are anti-fragile. You can look into the characteristics of anti-fragile systems in Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile. But basically they have redundancies. We seek efficiency in our rationalistic constructions. They have redundancies, and they allow components to fail without having the whole system fail. Efficient systems fail when one part collapses because they're efficient, because one part has one job and it needs to do just that job. Whereas redundant systems, things are modular, parts can step in and fill gaps that were left by other failing components. And then gradually over time, the things that cause some components to fail end up benefiting other components, and the evolutionary process of selection worked itself out. Not just in biological systems, but in companies that follow this kind of structure as well, and societies. So we can't just rationalistically construct how society ought to be. We have to tap into the evolutionary process itself. That's prior, that's primal, that's going on. So let's go back to the proposed solution here of going out together into the woods, basically, of starting a new form of society, escaping the toxins of this environment, basically seeking to survive. Similar to the founding myth of Rome, actually, which is interesting. But how do we affect this, given that the sustenance of such a community seems to rely, by all historical examples, on a continuance from an unbroken line of evolutionary tradition? So what is that tradition? If we can't agree on it, we're probably not going to stick together as a collective. We're probably not going to act as an evolutionary system. Evolutionary systems are not built, they're not rationalistically constructed by theories, they are evolved, clearly. And so something has to evolve into this next phase if it's going to be traditional in that sense. Now, the people who are aware of the toxic nature of our environment are online talking about it in ideological and political terms, largely, in intellectual terms more generally, but they're not connected together by any organic bonds, it seems. But, well, what about the internet technology? That itself evolved. And so maybe we just have to be progressive about our outlook and say that a techno-futurist, techno-primitivist, futuristic kind of outlook might be the only option at this point. So, okay, now we have a problem to solve. How do we distill from YouTube, from blogs, and from the community of people who are talking about the problems with our environment? How do we distill out of that a genuine organic community that will continue and then lay down a seed somewhere, and that seed will be allowed to grow? If you don't watch Kenneth Brown, I'd recommend it. He talks at length about a lot of these issues. Essentially, let's look at the traditional model of Indo-European societies. There's a priest class, there's a warrior class, and there is the working class. And then when they move out and conquer other territories, there's often like an untouchable underclass. But that's the hidden fourth, which exists in mythic systems all over the place. But anyway, the priest caste or class creates or engages with myth. The warrior class engages with political rule, and the economic class engages with business models, essentially. Now, the priest class develops myth. Myth is necessary because it has to do with these symbols. They come from the subconscious. We're not fully aware of what's going on there. They kind of just have to be allowed to speak through in religious terms. It's very likely that if there are true prophets, people who are just of the biological type to unify religious collectives, to create new religious movements, if prophecy is real, if prophets are real, they probably have to really approach it wholeheartedly in the prophetic mode, right? Not constantly being concerned about epistemological things and getting everything tied down in a rationalistic sense. So we need an organic myth that jives with the internet context. What is the modern myth here? The images are coming out through, I don't know, Murdoch and stuff like that to some extent. I don't really like their aesthetic all that much. I'm not crazy about it. But the images will be coming out of these cultural contexts, and the priest class basically meditates on it, and eventually their output is narrative, is stories. They construct narratives, and those narratives form bonds. But I don't think that society is just laid down by a priest class. I think it's a collective process, and you have to think about the warrior and mercantile elements as well simultaneously. Because the Indo-European system expanded as a tripartite system. Now, yes, probably the ultimate genesis is the priest class, the ideas that structure the mind of an individual, structure their behavior, and give them the agency to lay down some kind of larger social structure, and then the political apparatus solidifies around it. It probably does flow from the top to the bottom, from the priest to the merchant. But still, let's look at the internet as what's the business model? Because you can look at the work of the priest through the lens of the merchant, right? I mean, that's Protestantism largely. You go out and you start a business, a church. Is it profitable? What makes it profitable? Does it scale? How do you scale? How do you grow? How do you market? Like, all of these things are applicable to religion today. So rather than thinking we have to go back to the Stone Age when some priest class really did come down and deliver a new mythos, at least that's how I see it happening with something like Göbekli Tepe, and maybe with the beginning of the Indo-European system in its formalized form, like with the Yamna expansion. We don't have to go back to that. We have to look at, we have these three components and more. It's a more complex caste structure, class system that we're living in. So how do we incorporate all of these elements in a hierarchical fashion that does prioritize those eternal mythic elements, and then also allows for the assimilation of the warrior element? Well, the merchant and warrior elements are connected. The warrior element is competition between peers and creating rule of law by consent. And that, I mean, there's a market kind of behavior in the way that Germanic law originated, and there's a warrior element to the behavior of the merchant. All of these interpenetrate and have to do with one another. So again, going back, where is this myth? How do we solidify a system out of an internet-based context? We have our progenitors to look to, Nick Land, Mencius Moldbug, the pioneers of this whole sphere online. Let's start thinking about it seriously and then talk mythologically. Now, in that vein, let me just engage, like okay, but what is the myth? Well, what are the components of myth? I'm just going to lay down some mythic language, interpret it as you may. I'm not making truth claims in a strict sense here, but it involves cosmogony. First, how the world began, like that's what the Bible starts with. Usually when you teach a mythological system, you don't start with a cosmology, because that encodes metaphysical truths. That's what it's supposed to encode, not a temporal sequence of events in the sense of our modern scientific cosmogony with the Big Bang and all that. It's meant to represent chaos, order, their interaction, how the different archetypes flow from this primary kind of duality of the unlimited in its absolutely ordered form of divinity, the Godhead, the masculine, and then its chaotic, chthonic, underworld form of the swirling chaos of the primal waters. And then there's also, in some systems, the recognition of their ultimate unity. And that's where I would go, right? You need a cosmology. And I say, given like the stuff that's around today, given the tradition that exists today, that's the infinite. Has been throughout the Western tradition. That's the Faustian. Infinite space, that's the Faustian civilization. And Faust wants essentially infinite knowledge. Now, that's an interesting myth to look at and analyze it, because there's different consequences for Faust depending on who tells the story, right? In Goethe's telling, we have a happy ending when he basically repents and gets right with God, right? But there are other versions that Faust is damned. So that's an interesting notion, but infinite space is not just space. There's also the notion of the infinite in an absolute sense. Giordano Bruno talked about the infinite in that sense. Spinoza talked about the infinite in that sense. They're not the only ones. This notion of the unlimited in a very like abstract form is present in all of the esoteric traditions of the West. We got it from Platonism, Neoplatonism, probably in large part, which got it from Pythagoreanism, which probably got it from Hinduism. So it's a perennial tradition. I endorse this formulation in the modern day, though, of the infinite. Words matter, and the infinite is different from divinity or the undifferentiated. The infinite has alternative implications, not just simplicity, not just oneness, but a juxtaposition, a superposition. That's another good mythological term, I think. A superposition of the one and the many. I've used this formulation before. Divinity, or the infinite, is the superposition of all possible functions of the undifferentiated, of the simple, of the one. So the infinite is not just simplicity in the modern context, but it's also many worlds and different timelines and Rick and Morty crap. And this is a major part of the modern mythology. People see things in these terms. People are receptive to this. If they could go to church and experience some of that thinking and not just 2,000-year-old texts or 3,000-year-old texts, then, you know, maybe they would keep going to church, right? Maybe that you have to speak to the spirit of the time. And the spirit is living. It's not in the dead word. It's not in the dead letter. It's in the living spirit. The letter evolves. The spirit, the word evolves. And our word is infinite. That's your cosmogony. That's the origin. And you do tell it chronologically. At first, there was oneness, there was love, there was the infinite, the absolute, and then, you know, the chaotic element, the divine feminine, separated from the divine masculine in mythological terms, but you want to use more specificity than this. You want names for archetypes, and suitable names. Like the names of the gods had etymological meanings for the Greeks. The Greeks studied etymology. That's a lot of what Socrates talks about in Plato. So the gods have relevant names. They represent things that are significant to the community, significant to the spirit of the time. That's the cosmogonic aspect, the creation of the world and the filling out of it. And then mythology also has heroic tales, which basically tell us our virtues. It describes the nature of our archetypes, what we can become. And this is fiction, largely. There's a creative mode of mythology where in the past it was an authoritative structure handed down and you just had to buy into it or be excommunicated and shunned. That applied in Athens, that's why Socrates was killed. Since the chivalric period, we have had a creative kind of mythological expression where it's great men, great individuals who create these mythic archetypes. Dante, Shakespeare, and the rest of the civilization resonates with it because they're speaking a kind of mythic language. They're resonating with something going on at a deep-seated evolutionary level that we all share in common. It's a collective story. So how do you generate those individual narratives? Well, they kind of have to be truthful as well as resonant with underlying archetypes, which means in terms of building mythology, you have to do heroic deeds. You have to do some things that are worthy of tales and in immortality. And I think that's the way for a genuine mythology to be built. You have to have great men doing great things, and people have to tell stories about them. But fiction is good in the meantime, I guess, and comparative mythology and studying the narratives of the past. So that's the heroic tale in myth, and then there's ethics in myth, parables that are meant to kind of guide us. And in advanced mythological systems like Buddhism or Hinduism, you go beyond just parables, although you do still have parables, which are anecdotal, right? It's like there's a scientific process of ethics. We recognize that certain behaviors lead to good consequences for us, certain behaviors lead to bad consequences, and we try to pass that knowledge on to our kids and our community. And so we first have like anecdotes about stuff like the moss grows on the north side of the tree, like this sort of unsystematized just aphorisms and things of that nature. Those are the parables, and then you eventually build a model of what's going on with this, and that's a system of ethics. That's still part of myth, and we need a system of ethics that follows logically, using the language of our time, which is reason, follows logically from the cosmogony, follows from the infinite. And you can look to Schopenhauer to some extent for a good foundation to that, although he doesn't cover it all. You can look to Hinduism and Buddhism as well, looking at the dynamics of reincarnation. But I think that something more systematic is possible, and I've talked about some of this in my Metaphysics of the Perennial Philosophy series. Basically, yeah, those mythic components, I've thought about these. I'll probably have to stop here with this video and then rethink. I don't like putting out bad philosophy, but if I tell myself I need to put out some myth because people need myth, and it's going to have philosophical appearances, but what we really need is myth because that's the level at which we need consensus. Not conscious consensus, subconscious consensus. That's the only way communities stay together. So consider that. I'll talk some more in this vein in the coming months. So thank you for listening.